The basis of each sound starts at element 1. It's the green part on the 4-element chart. Take the printed chart and look at green, element 1. If you look closely at the chart, you will see that the green element 1 is named oscillators. This term and its variations are used on every subtractive synthesizer. In the green element 1, you can see that there are two independent oscillators, oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. There are synthesizers on the market with more than two oscillators, of course. But for explaining subtractive synthesis, two oscillators are more than enough. Let's look at some hardware and look for some oscillators. If we look at the sequential Prophet 600, we can see it has oscillator A and oscillator B. The Moog Mini Moog has an oscillator bank, and inside of that is oscillator 1, 2, and 3. The Alesis Andromeda uses the name OSC1 and OSC2. The Virus B names this section oscillators and adds number 1 and 2 for each separate oscillator. The Pro 53 names it just like the Prophet 600, oscillator A and oscillator B. The Native Instrument Massive has 3 oscillators, OSC1, OSC2, and OSC3. And Predator has oscillator 1, 2, and 3. On the Jupiter 8 and the Korg MS-20, it's called a voltage-controlled oscillator, or VCO. So the keyword for green element 1 is oscillator. In the chapter introduction of element 1, we have learned that element 1 is the basis for each sound and that the main part is called an oscillator. These oscillators use waveforms for generating their basic sound. We have 2 oscillators in our element 1, but for explaining the component waveform, we'll use only one oscillator as an example. Waveforms used in subtractive synthesis are displayed as names and/or symbols. If we look at green element 1, we can see them here. And I am sure you have seen these symbols and names before. Here we have the sine waveform, triangle waveform, saw waveform, square waveform, pulse waveform, noise waveform, digital or sample waveform, and the sub-oscillator. Try hearing some waveforms by using one of your own synths like I do now in my studio. Look for the oscillator section and the wave selector. Pick a preset or initial preset and change the waveform. The waveform symbol has a certain look, as you can see here in the Mini Moog patch. And if you connect the synthesizer to an electronic device called an oscilloscope, the wave will be visible and will look identical to its symbol. The sine symbol looks like a sine wave, and the saw wave looks like a saw symbol.
Harmonics. Let's take a closer look at a synthesizer called the Chameleon 5000. It uses additive synthesis, which can show us very easily how a waveform is made up and also how harmonics work in the acoustic world. Here we see a full row of harmonic bars. The first bar is the fundamental. This makes it possible for us to determine the pitch of a tone. Above that, we have the other harmonics, and as you can hear, changing them changes the character of the sound. When we listen to only the fundamental again, we can tell you now that what you hear is a pure sine waveform, or rather the pure frequency of the note played. When we play A4, you hear a pure 440 Hz tone, or a 440 Hz sine wave. Let's say it again because this is essential. A single frequency is basically a sine wave that you hear at a certain frequency and at certain volumes. Okay, so we've talked about the fundamental, which again is the base frequency of the note we play. What you hear now when we play the keyboard using only the fundamental is the pure frequency or pitch, which is a sine waveform. But there is more. The character of a musical sound is formed by the harmonics above the fundamental. By adding the other harmonics to it, you can hear that the character of the sound changes. We can now demonstrate that these harmonics are all separate sine waves but at different frequencies. Now you only hear the fundamental, but we'll bring it down in volume and pull up the second harmonic. You're now hearing another sine waveform but at a higher frequency. Also, if we turn up the other harmonics separately, you'll hear individual sine waves. The funny thing is that if we play these harmonics and sine waves all together with the fundamental, we don't hear the sine waves individually, but instead we hear them all as one sound with a certain character. The fundamental is the loudest in volume, which makes it so that we hear it as the dominant pitch, and it determines which note you actually hear. The other harmonics and sines are not heard individually anymore, but are perceived as the character of the sound. An acoustic instrument like the guitar also has these harmonics, and they move dynamically in volume. We can demonstrate that for you by loading a sample of this guitar into the Chameleon 5000. The Chameleon analyzes the sample and reproduces the sound using the harmonics. We've imported the sample, and as you can see, the harmonics are displayed. Before the harmonic display field, we have another field that displays the volume changes in time for this sound. This volume change starts here at the left and ends on the right. Each time we play a note, the volume change is followed. You can also see little points on the volume curve. When we click on these points, you can see how the harmonics displayed in the field above change in volume. So, by clicking on these points, you can see how the volumes of each individual harmonic change in time. Chameleon reproduces the acoustic sound this way. Cool, isn't it? If we go back to a subtractive synthesizer, we find that these harmonics are also inside most waveforms, but they are static in volume instead of being dynamic as in our example of the guitar sound. In subtractive synthesizers, harmonics in a waveform are static, so every harmonic is always at a certain volume level. For instance, in the Chameleon 5000, we can generate a static saw waveform. As you see, the harmonics each have their own level. We can make other waveforms such as the square. This looks very different from the saw wave. We'll talk about it later when we discuss the individual waveforms. To understand sound in synthesizers, it is important that you know what the fundamental and harmonics are. At a later point in several places in this training, you will see that these harmonics and the fundamental determine the sound and have a lot of effect on the sound, even in places where you may not expect it.
Oscillators use waveforms for generating their basic sound, and a character is formed by the harmonics inside each waveform. As we discussed in this chapter Waveform Part 1, the waveforms used in subtractive synthesis are displayed as names or symbols. If we look again at green element 1, we can see the sine waveform, triangle waveform, saw waveform, square waveform, pulse waveform, noise waveform, digital or sample waveform, and the sub-oscillator. The question is, of course, how do we use them? In the booklet you will see a chapter entitled Waveforms Part 2, which contains a list of the 4-element synth waveforms. For each waveform, we provided you with a reference instrument, some examples of instruments that use that waveform, as well as a character description. The reference instruments or sounds have an important purpose in this training. If you want to build your own sounds, then you need to know what waveform type you need to start with. To make it easier, I gave you these reference instruments and a short character description behind each waveform as a starting point. Remember that the foundation of a synth sound starts here in the element 1 section. So you'll need to pick the right waveform from the beginning to get the results you want. Now it's your turn to memorize the waveform together with the instruments, the reference, and its character. Read over this chapter, Waveforms Part 2 of the booklet, and study it. As you can see, these are easy to recognize instruments. So if you want to make a sound, take the instrument, the reference, the character that is the closest match to the sound, and then pick the waveform that you see in this list. Of course, this method is not 100% foolproof, but is still a very valid starting point. This list helps you to avoid choosing the wrong waveform. For example, you know after memorizing this reference list, if you wish to build a brass type of sound, you shouldn't start with a square or a triangle. First, let's listen to the pure sound of this waveform. The sound is the same as a test tone on your audio mixer, or this old test tone heard on television. The special character of this waveform is that it has no harmonics, only the fundamental. So what you hear is the pure tone or pitch. Look in the booklet chapter Waveforms Part 2 for the image of the harmonics of this waveform. As you can see, there are none. This waveform is, in other words, totally empty, a blank slate. No harmonics, only a pure tone. This means that this waveform doesn't have much to offer when you add filters. They are a waste of time to use because there are no upper harmonics which can be filtered. Nevertheless, this pure fundamental tone can be very musical and very useful for certain sounds. Here's a few instrument examples so you can learn to recognize the sine waveform. Whistle. This is a typical sound that can be reproduced pretty closely using subtractive synthesis. Very recognizable sound and as reference for the sinus waveform. Organ. By using 3 oscillators that are each using a sinus waveform, you can easily make organ sounds. Many organs use sinus waveforms. The drawbars are in fact a row of sinuses in a certain tuning. That these sinuses do not always sound like a pure sinus sound has to do with distortions of the electronic circuits or the speaker cabinets that are used in the organ. Singing saw. This is also a typical instrument that can be reproduced pretty well using subtractive synthesis. Subbasses. Because of the fact that the sinus waveform has no harmonics, you can create very deep subbasses. I hope, by the way, that you can hear the bass in this sound example. Triangle. First, let's listen to the pure sound of this waveform. As you'll hear, this sound is similar to the sinus, but sounds more silkier and mellow. In fact, it has a few harmonics that add this character. As a reference instrument, I think of a recorder, and if you listen careful, you can hear this character in the wave already. If you were to play this waveform by itself, it's easy to confuse it with a sine wave. That's not far off, because they sound very similar to each other. To hear the difference, I play them one after the other. The first 2 notes are the triangle waveform, and then the next 2 notes are the sinus. I'll do this twice. Check out the booklet chapter entitled Waveforms Part 2 for the harmonic structure of this waveform. Sound examples. Organ, Vox type. This is a typical Vox organ sound. Church organ. A typical clean church organ sound. Flute-alike. In this sound I added a bit of noise using a second oscillator. Even so, the sound is mainly made up of just the triangle waveform. Saw. First, let's listen to the pure sound of this waveform. This waveform is very versatile, and the reason for that is its harmonics. It contains all possible harmonics, both even and odd ones, starting from the fundamental on up. So check out the booklet chapter Waveforms Part 2 to see the harmonic composition. As a reference instrument, a trumpet is a perfect example, and its character can be described as brassy. Let's listen to a few synth sounds that are typical made from the saw waveform. Synth trumpet. This lead sound showcases the trumpet character of the saw waveform very much. Only one oscillator is used, so the wave can be heard clearly. Synth brass. This is a classic 80s synth brass sound. This sound uses two oscillators. Both oscillators play saw waveforms. Bass sound. This is a classic Moog-style bass sound that uses two oscillators with both playing saw waveforms. Bass sound 2. This is a one oscillator bass sound. In this sound you can clearly hear the saw waveform. Strings. This is a typical saw string sound. Very nice for high string parts and also great for thin sounding string pad sounds. There's more to learn about the saw waveform sound. The saw waveform itself is static, so in order to thicken the sound you need to use a lot of chorus. Listen to the same sound without chorus and delay. There are more oscillators being used to thicken the sound, but you can hear that it is less thick without the chorus. To fully hear the difference between the saw strings with and without chorus, we play them side by side now for comparison. First you hear the sound without chorus, and then the same part with chorus. Note also that the chorus makes the stereo spread wider as well. We come back to this type of saw waveform sound later on, once we discuss another waveform that is quite good for creating pad sounds. Classic lead sound. For classic lead sound, the saw waveform is great as well. Listen to this classic Minimoog type lead sound. Saw dance lead sound. This is a typical contemporary dance lead sound made using saw waveforms. There are more oscillators involved and they are very widely detuned. We'll discuss this technique of detuning oscillators in a later chapter. Saw trance sequence sound. This is a typical trance sequence sound. First, let's listen to the pure sound of this waveform. The square is a very special waveform. Be sure to read the booklet chapter Waveforms Part 2, specifically the section entitled Square and Pulse Waveform. Let's listen to the pure sound of this waveform. The square is a very special waveform. And as you can hear, it sounds like it looks, very hollow. For an instrument reference in recognizing this waveform, I use the clarinet. The square waveform is also an excellent waveform choice for real synth sounds like a hollow-sounding bass or drum and bass sound. The square waveform sounds very distinct and is quite different from a saw, sinus, triangle, the waveforms we discussed already. Let's listen again to this hollow bass sound and then toggle between the waves. I'm switching between the square and saw waveform to show you how different the saw waveform sounds from the square waveform. I can also select the triangle waveform as well, so now we can clearly hear the different characteristics of all three waveforms: triangle, saw, and square. What you can do at home with your own synth is to look for a bass sound and toggle between the waveforms. Try to use a synthesizer that is not too complex. In the booklet, we discussed that the square waveform and the pulse waveform with 50% symmetry are basically the same waveforms. In case you missed it, go read the section entitled Square, Pulse Waveform, in the Waveform Part 2 chapter of the booklet. Once you change the symmetry or pulse width of a square waveform, you turn it into a pulse waveform. It is called a pulse because you can adjust the pulse width. Let's listen to what it sounds like when we adjust the pulse width. Here's the Jupiter 8 and I select the square pulse waveform. If you look more to the left, we can see that we have a control here that enables us to change the pulse width of this square waveform. As long as I don't change this fader, the pulse waveform remains 50% and it's the same as a square waveform. With the Jupiter 8, it's easy to prove that both of these waveforms are the same. You can see here the Jupiter waveform knob, and it has the pulse square and square waveform next to each other. The waveform on the right, displayed as a square wave, cannot change its pulse width, so therefore stays as square. The other waveform on the left, you can see here, allows you to change the pulse width. The symbol on the panel shows it. I have not changed the pulse width of this waveform, so it should sound the same as the square waveform next to it. I will toggle the waveform knob now and you can hear that they are the same in sound. Now more about this pulse waveform. If I keep the pulse waveform selected and change the pulse width, then you can hear the changes in sound. It goes from sounding hollow to sounding nasally. To recognize this waveform, you could think of a clarinet that turns into a oboe. Let's do this in practice. I'll make a simulation of a clarinet on my Jupiter 8 and change the sound into a oboe just by changing the pulse width. The great feature about this adjustable pulse width is that it gives you a lot of variation inside one waveform. I can now make a bass sound with the Jupiter 8 using a pulse wave and make some wonderful variations by just changing the pulse width. Watch this. Let's look at another synth. One of my presets I created for the Virus synthesizer was the SH101 bass. As you can see here, the square wave is used inside oscillator 1, but with a certain pulse width setting. If I change this pulse width setting, the sound changes. If I go fully to the left with the pulse width knob, this gives me a 50% pulse or a square waveform. Did you notice that I can already get a few variations on these presets simply by changing one knob? Personalizing your sound for your music doesn't always have to be done using huge, complex changes. In the pulse chapter, we changed the pulse width manually. This way we could change the color of this waveform. We did this, for example, with the Jupiter 8 and a bass sound. You can see that the selector on the Jupiter 8 is set to manual. This means that the fader sets the pulse width at a static point. When I take this fader and move it up and down, it generates an interesting sound. Of course, my arm gets tired doing this, and therefore we have modulators that are inside the synthesizers. They can make these movements all day long without getting tired. These modulators are parts from Yellow Element 4. One of the most common is the LFO for adding pulse width modulation to a sound. Let's take this LFO setting on the Jupiter 8 and listen to what happens. What you hear now is that the LFO of the Jupiter 8 changes the pulse width. How fast the pulse width is changed by the LFO, I can adjust by changing its speed parameter. The LFO is most often used to modulate the pulse waveform, and you can hear the sound getting fuller and a bit chorus-like in character. For recognizing this waveform, remember the reference moving and chorus. Let's look at a few other things. This is the virus B, and also here we can connect an LFO to the pulse width. Here we have LFO 1, and with this button we can select its destinations. I select PW1 plus 2, which stands for pulse widths of oscillator 1 and 2. The value knob at the virus B is now the amount control, and as you can hear, once I start turning it, the LFO starts to modulate the pulse width. Pulse modulated by other parts of Yellow Element 4. Although it's very common to use the LFO to modulate the pulse width, other parts from Yellow Element 4 can be connected to modulate the pulse width as well. When we look at the Jupiter 8 again, I can switch the pulse width modulation selector to Envelope 1. The envelope is time-based and can also change the pulse width, and it sounds like this. If I change the setting of the envelope, this controls the way in which the pulse width will change in time. As you can hear, it started to sound a bit like a fuzz guitar. In the chapter entitled Waveform Modulation, we'll go more into detail about this. Now let's play and compare a few sounds that change the pulse width with other parts from Element 4. This is pulse width controlled by velocity, This is changing pulse width with a sequencer. This is changing pulse width with velocity, making more a clavinet sound. Pulse width modulation examples with other synths. Every synth on the market has its own way of implementing the pulse width modulation. So you still need the manual of a synth to understand the way it is achieved. Here we have the sequential Prophet 600. In this section you can see we have an LFO. With this selector we can choose the destinations of this LFO, and as you can see, this can be PWA plus B. The A and B stands for oscillator A and B, which you can find here. If we switch this PWA plus B on, the connection is made. All we have to do now is increasing the initial amount by turning this knob. When I turn it, you can hear the pulse width changing by the LFO. Noise is the perfect word to describe this waveform. It generates a lot of noise. In many synthesizers, we do have the option to choose between white noise and pink noise. Here we have the Jupiter 8, and on it I can select noise as a waveform, and by using this selector I can switch between white or pink noise. You can hear that pink sounds far more darker and heavier than white. The white noise has far more sound possibilities than pink noise, and let's check that out by listening to some sound examples. White noise sound examples. Wind. This is of course a classic white noise sound. You can hear the movement in the sound, and that is done by the filter and the envelopes. Sound effects. White noise is also great for other sound effects. Listen to these examples. What is also very nice is to let all the changes you hear in the sound be time-based, so that it syncs to the tempo of your music. Tuned noise. By using the filter of a synthesizer, it is possible to make a kind of tuned noise sound. If you combine it with a pad part, it starts to get very cool. Pink noise. Big dinosaur steps. Well, I hope you are playing the DVD on a good speaker system. Otherwise you might not hear this low rumble sound. Big noise is already very dark, but by adding the filter and some settings, it can be really dark and heavy, like big dinosaur steps. Container hit. This is a brighter sounding sound than the big dinosaur steps. Sounds like somebody pounding on a big container or a big metal box. In this old-style recorder simulation sound on the Jupiter 8, the white noise is used to give the recorder the noisy part of its sound. By mixing both oscillators and picking the right balance between the triangle waveform from oscillator 1 and the noise waveform from oscillator 2, you can get this nice old-style simulation of a recorder. Snare drum. White noise is great also for percussion sounds, like this electronic snare drum. The noise is part of the whole sound, but if I turn the oscillator on and off, you can hear that the sound is created by using a plug sound and the noise sound. Now you are going to hear a collection of digital waveforms. As you'll hear, these sound colors are very random and versatile. More about the digital waveform. First, let's explain what a digital waveform is. In the chapter entitled Harmonics, we used the Chameleon 5000 to show you how a waveform is built up. With the saw waveform or triangle waveform, the construction of the harmonics follows a certain compositional pattern. With digital waveforms, this composition can be free or can be made by analyzing samples. Here we have the Chameleon 5000, and when I move these sliders, which are harmonics, I can create my own fantasy waveform. Today, there are many software synthesizers that use these type of generated waveforms. We can also analyze a sample and let the synthesizer recalculate a waveform for us. The software analyzes one cycle of the audio and reproduces it as a waveform. Of course, this waveform is static in sound, because it's only a single waveform. Still, it can be very useful and great for creating new and exciting presets. Let me show you an example. This blue preset uses an analyzed vocal sample which is transformed into a digital waveform. If I take the naked waveform and play it, you can hear that it is indeed very static, just like a regular pulse or saw waveform. But the sound color is very different, and that is what makes digital waveforms so great to use. Recognizing these waveforms is very easy, because they don't fit in the references that we have learned to distinguish the other waveforms, such as sinus, triangle, saw, square, and pulse. They often have a digital character or contain the character of an analyzed sample. Well, maybe it's easier to just say that anything that sounds totally different and can be found in the classic waveforms such as sine, triangle, saw, square, or pulse waveform are most likely digital waveforms. And here we have a few examples of sounds that use digital waveforms. More about sampled waveforms. Well, a sample waveform is a digital picture of a sound. So if you sample a guitar, the waveform is a digital picture of the audio that was produced on a guitar. Most workstation synthesizers and rumplers have sampled oscillator waveforms. In case you don't know what a rumpler means, it's a type of synthesizer that contains a huge library of samples within the synth, and they are stored in a ROM memory. Most rumplers can handle bread and butter sounds of all kinds. Of course, a sampler also uses sampled waveforms, but the difference is that you can make your own samples or you can load them in from the hard disk or CD or DVD. Well, I've decided to place this topic inside the waveform section. Some may disagree with me, but for understanding this feature, I think it's best to include it this way. The reason is because a sub-oscillator is not an independent oscillator, and that's why it's called sub-oscillator. There's sometimes a bit of confusion of how the sub-oscillator functions, and if we look here at the virus B, we can see a knob called sub. Some might think that it generates a kind of sub-low frequencies or that it increases the bass amount of a sound. Well, it can indeed increase the bass, but not in the manner that some might think. What the sub-oscillator really does is divide the oscillator so that a waveform 1 octave lower is generated. Most of the time it generates a square waveform. So if I select a saw waveform and open the sub-oscillator, a square waveform 1 octave below the saw waveform is generated. How to use the sub-oscillator. Using the sub-oscillator is something you have to do with intelligence. It is not wise to simply open the knob as a standard move with the thought that it's all going to sound fatter. Let's give you an example. The sound you hear is a bass groove, but it sounds a bit high. It is playing in the key E. The option you have is, of course, to open the sub-oscillator to get a deeper bass sound. But don't forget that you also have the option to play the same groove without the sub-oscillator, at 1 octave lower. Now we play them one after the other. First time will be with the sub-oscillator, and the second time will be without sub-oscillator, but played 1 octave lower. You notice that the sounds differ. The sound with the sub-oscillator is far more dominant in the mix. Let's play it again for you. So in conclusion, it really depends on what kind of sound you're looking for and what sounds best in the mix. Another thing you have to keep in mind is the fact that if you add the sub-oscillator, this adds an extra octave below the range you are playing. This octave might happen to be even outside the musical range. What I mean to say is that if you open the sub-oscillator and you are already playing in a low keyboard range, it's only adding growl and muddiness. The sub-oscillator can be so low that it is not even a tone anymore. The frequencies are so low that you need big speakers and to be a big distance away from them to even hear or feel them. For an example, now I'm playing a lower keyboard range and I'll add the sub-oscillator. Notice the change in the sound. It gets growly now. Note that these frequencies are so low that you can only feel them on big speaker systems. But remember, the speaker pushes out the frequency without deciding for you if this frequency can be heard or not. As you can imagine with low frequency, they eat up a lot of energy. It takes far more energy to move a big speaker than a small speaker, which is used for higher frequencies. So, the end result to your mix is that it will sound very soft. That's because there's too much energy into frequencies you cannot hear. Be careful with the sub-oscillator and keep in mind that it adds another octave below. Please look at the chart of the 4-element synths again. We started with explaining the waveform part inside element 1. We explained how to use these waveforms and how to recognize them. But as you can see, there is also an input in this part of the oscillator. This means that you can connect something to the waveform, and these are parts from yellow element 4. In the chapter Waveform Part 2 section, Pulse Modulated, you already heard the modulated waveform. So if you followed the route of the DVD menu, you already know a bit about waveform modulation. Now we dive more into detail. What happens with the waveform modulation is that you connect a part from yellow element 4 and it starts changing the symmetry of the waveform. So without connecting element 4, waveform modulation is not possible at all. In the chapter Before You Go On, we already discussed yellow element 4 because it controls all the synth parts. The key for yellow element 4 is it makes the other elements work and adds dynamic changes. What yellow element 4 starts to change of the waveform is its symmetry. We told you about symmetry in the booklet chapter Waveform Part 2. In case you forgot, please read it again in the booklet. If we look at the classic analog synths, we only see the name pulse width. Because of the fact that it is most effective on the pulse waveform, They left out this function for the other waveforms. They also use pulse width as name for this function instead of calling it symmetry. This is logic after all, because if you change the symmetry of a pulse waveform, you change in fact the width of the pulse. Look again at the animation. Here you can see what happens if the pulse waveform is modulated by an LFO. So, at all those synths, you only see pulse width, but basically it's the same as symmetry, but addressed only at the square or pulse waveform. So remember, waveform modulation means that apart from yellow, element 4, changes the symmetry of a waveform. Symmetry is the same as pulse width, but then used on a pulse or square waveform. Let's do this waveform modulation on the Jupiter 8 and explain it also according to the 4-element synth chart. At the Jupiter 8 panel, we see here the pulse width modulation and also a selector. If you set the selector to manual, the pulse width is changed manually by the slider. The other options we have are LFO and envelope 1. If we look now at the 4-element synth chart, we find the LFO and envelope as parts inside element 4. What happens if we select LFO inside the Jupiter 8 is that the LFO part gets connected to the pulse width parameter. The fader of the Jupiter 8 now changes in function and becomes a mount control. This function as a mount control is needed because otherwise the LFO would run at full power on the pulse width parameter. You can hear that with fully open LFO mount, the sound is a bit extreme. Therefore we need this mount control. Let's start with some example sounds of the classic way of using waveform modulation at the pulse square waveform. Pet sound using LFO modulation. This sound is made using the pulse square waveform modulated by an LFO. The modulation of the LFO is with a certain speed and amount to make the sound full. You can recognize this waveform by its movement in the sound. It's similar to a chorus effect. This movement is unique for this waveform, and no other waveform has this characteristic sound. If I switch off the FX and only play one single oscillator, you can hear the movement of the sound even more. Dance lead sound using LFO modulation. This sound is made using the pulse square waveform modulated by an LFO. Only the speed of the LFO and the amount of the modulation is very deep. This adds this typical dance lead sound. In this sound example, you can hear the LFO is modulating the pulse width very deeply. It generates this unique moving sound of this waveform. What you have heard until now is the irregular square or pulse waveform. After that, we modulated this waveform using an LFO. In the classic way, we call this pulse width modulation, the modulation of the pulse width. In fact, the symmetry of the waveform is modulated. In the early days, only the square or pulse was available for this function, because it was most effective on this waveform. But we can apply this to other waveforms as well. Let's do this. This was a sinus waveform, and as you can hear, the result is quite interesting. This was a saw waveform, and the results are not very striking. Therefore, this waveform is not very useful in combination with symmetry modulation. This was a spectrum waveform, a digital fantasy waveform. And as you could hear, this sound is very interesting. So it's all a matter of trial and error to find out if the symmetry modulation of other waveforms makes sense. Listen to this next sound. This is also produced using a modulated spectrum waveform. In the chapter Introduction of Element 1, we learned that the element 1 is at the core of every sound and that the main building block of a sound is called an oscillator. These oscillators use waveforms for generating their basic sound. We have two oscillators in our element 1, and that is enough to explain the use of oscillators.
If we take a closer look at one of the oscillators, we see that each one is built around two parts called pitch and wave. Both parts are separated by using different colors of green. In the DVD section entitled Waveforms, we learned about the waveform part of an oscillator. The sound color of an oscillator is determined by what waveform is used. The other part of an oscillator is the pitch part. We mentioned this earlier, but the 4-element synth chart helps you to understand that a synthesizer is sometimes less complicated than you might think. So, from studying the chart, we can conclude that an oscillator is designed around these two parts, and if you look at a synthesizer and see tons of settings and knobs inside of the oscillator section, these two main parts are still at the core, no matter how much stuff has been piled up on top. We know you're thinking, what can we do with the pitch part? Well, a lot more than you think. If we look at the chart again and examine one of the two oscillators, we can see that the pitch part has two controls and also inputs. The two control knobs tune the oscillator. One is the octave knob and the other one is the fine tune knob. We also have these inputs inside the pitch part. By the way, having just two inputs is mainly symbolic because in practice we can have many more inputs than just two. For our discussion, though, the two inputs on the 4-element synth signifies that they are used often and that many parts of element 4 are and can be connected to it. Let's show you the main connections that are made to these pitch inputs of an oscillator. Here again we have the classic Mini Moog. As you can see, it has 3 oscillators and the third one has an extra function. You can see Rob playing, but you can't hear any changes in pitch. There's a reason for this. An oscillator doesn't know what pitch to play unless you connect the keyboard to it. And yes, we are once again back to the element 4. The key for element 4 is, it makes the other elements work and adds dynamic changes. Most of the time, this connection is a standard one, but it can be switched off as well. On the Mini Moog, it's called Oscillator 3 controls, and it means that if you switch it on, then the keyboard now controls Oscillator 3. We'll tell you the reason we see this function implemented only on Oscillator 3 inside the Mini Moog later on the DVD. But for now, the functioning of connecting the keyboard to the pitch of an oscillator is a function we can find in many synthesizers. Let's have a look. Here we have the Virus B, and if we press the Edit button of the oscillator section, we see a screen called Key Follow. This word describes this function very well. It dictates how the oscillator follows the keyboard. Inside the synth, we also have the option to adjust it, not simply switch it on and off. If you use +32 as a value, then the Virus B oscillator will follow the normal keyboard pitch. But if we use the value of -32, then the Virus B oscillator follows the keyboard in a reverse way. Even +64 is possible, and with that setting, one octave is turned into 2 octaves. Okay, so it's usually best to keep it at +32, the normal value. Otherwise, your music could sound a bit odd. Why do we have this function? Well, for one thing, at times, it can be really useful to be able to switch the keyboard on and off.
Oscillator pitch octaves detuning. Here on the Mini Moog we can see that range stands for the octave setting of the oscillator. This tunes the oscillator in octaves, and if I use two oscillators, I can either decide to key them at the same range or detune them in octave steps. The type of sound you are planning to make will determine how you set these. For example, if you create a bass sound, you naturally want to use lower octave settings. Of course, for creating lead sounds, you want to use higher octave settings. But I guess you understand. By using two oscillators for a sound and making octave changes, then of course the sound in general is changed. You can keep both oscillators at the same octave or have each of them in different octaves. Listen to this. First, I start with both oscillators in the same octave. But if I switch one oscillator to another octave, the sound character changes as well. So one can conclude by using more than one oscillator, the octave function does more than just change octaves. It also changes the sound. By the way, on many of today's synthesizers, the octave knob is named semi, because you can set the values between the octaves. These values are usually incremented in half steps, which gives you 12 semitones per octave. For example, I can show you on the Virus B. Having these in-between values is of course much more versatile than only having octaves as a setting. This now allows you to detune a third or a fifth note. In short, octaves inside an oscillator allow us to choose the overall pitch range of a sound in a general way. For a bass sound, you can pick a lower octave range, and for the other sounds, such as leads, you can select higher ranges. Once you start using two or more oscillators, the octave turns into a sound shaping tool as well. Oscillator pitch fine detuning. A more delicate change to a sound is created by using the detune function of the oscillators. Here on the Mini Moog, we can detune oscillator 2 against oscillator 1. Note that both are set on the same octave setting. If you are using only one oscillator, then of course the detune function is useless. You're only hearing the one oscillator, and by detuning it, the result is that you are playing out of tune. You need two oscillators to effectively detune one against the other. Let's shut down oscillator 1. You can clearly hear that it detunes the whole sound. So when your goal is to create musical sound, it's best not to use fine detuning if you're only going to use one oscillator. If I turn oscillator 1 back on, then the detuning makes sense again. Like we said, you really need two or more oscillators to effectively detune one against the other. Most of today's synthesizers offer a fine detuning range of 100 cents. That is the range of one semitone. The fine detuning parameter can have positive or negative values. Once I start detuning oscillator 2, you can hear that the character of the sound changes quite a bit. If I use only a little detuning, it sounds like a classic synth lead sound. But if I detune a bit more, it suddenly becomes a dance lead sound. In between these two settings, there are countless variations possible, each with their own sound character. Let's do the same now with the software synthesizer Predator. The first sound is a classic lead sound. With this preset, I detuned only oscillator 2. In the readout field of Predator, we can see that the detuned value of oscillator 2 is plus 2 cents. By changing the fine detune function of the oscillator 2 again, the sound becomes a little fuller. The fine is set to plus 12. As you will notice, with only 12 cents of detuning, I can create another type of lead sound. Now I'm going to play this first sound and then this change sound. If we detune the sound much deeper, let's say plus 38 cents, the sound now changes into an example of a dance lead sound in use today. Isn't that cool? By changing only one parameter, we can come up with so many variations. Let's play them again, one after the other. Now you have listened to sounds with both oscillators set on the same octave setting. Then you can create a lot of nuances and sound variations by detuning the oscillators. If you have an octave difference between the two oscillators, the effect of detuning is different. The fact of the matter is, you don't want to detune too much. In this sound, oscillator 2 is one octave higher than oscillator 1, and it is not detuned very much. If I detune it too deeply, it will make the whole sound out of tune. That's not to say that a bit of deeper detuning can be used to create a nice contemporary lead sound. What you should do at home on your own synthesizers is to tweak some presets and get a bit of feel for this parameter. Find the second oscillator on your synth and then use the detune parameter. This works really great on lead sounds or pad sounds. Experiment and you will soon discover the endless variations you can make by only using detune. Oscillator pitch fine-tuning with more than 2 oscillators. So far, we only used 2 oscillators to demonstrate the huge influence detuning can have on a sound. But what if a synth has 3 oscillators and even more? Well, then you can do some nice tricks. Listen to this sound. In this preset, there are 3 oscillators being used, and the trick to this sound is not to detune one oscillator, but rather leave this one on pitch. The other 2 oscillators are detuned. One has positive detuning and the other one has negative detuning. We can see how the detuning is set in the readout field of Predator. Oscillator 1 is 0, oscillator 2 is plus 10 cents, and oscillator 3 is minus 10 cents. You may already hear that this sound is a string-like sound, and by adding the third oscillator, the sound becomes fuller. This is very useful for these type of sounds. By detuning one oscillator with a positive detuning and the other one with a negative detuning, the sound becomes much fuller and sounds as if both oscillators were positively or both negatively detuned. Let's demonstrate this. First, listen to the sound with positive and negative detuning, and then listen to the sound with 2 oscillators being positively detuned. Maybe you have noticed already, but the overall sound is going out of tune. This is because oscillator 2 has a setting of plus 10 cents and oscillator 3 has a setting of plus 20 cents. So in general, if you use 3 oscillators, it's best to detune one positive, the other one negative, and one not detuned at all. If a synthesizer has more than 3 oscillators, you may use them all, of course, but keep in mind that more is not always better. It depends on the type of sound you want to make and the musical context for that sound. Please look at the chart of the 4-element synth. In this chapter, we are going to explain the pitch part inside the element 1. We've shown you what you can do with the pitch features inside an oscillator. As you may have noticed, there's far more to it than just pitching an oscillator. The octave and fine-tuning knobs are in fact sound shaping tools. In addition to the octave knob and the fine-tune knob, we also have inputs inside the pitch part of an oscillator. This means that you can connect parts from yellow, element 4, into the pitch part. One connection that you have already seen in the pitch chapter and before you move on chapter was the keyboard. That's very much needed if you want to play melodies with a synthesizer. As you may already know, the keyboard is also a yellow, element 4 part which controls the pitch and therefore utilizes pitch modulation. Remember also that the other part from element 4 can also be connected to the pitch input of an oscillator. The function of yellow, element 4 is it makes the other elements work and adds dynamic changes. Listen to this melody with vibrato. Both changes of pitch are caused by element 4, which proves our statement that it makes the other element work and adds dynamic changes. To keep a nice flow to this training right now, we are going to explain pitch modulation in general terms only. Otherwise, you get bogged down with too many details and we haven't even reached the element 4 chapter yet. The keyboard connection is a basic pitch connection. Vibrato is another main pitch modulation. If you look at the 4-element synth chart and the element 1 section, you can see a hand. This hand symbols the sync function between oscillators. At the 4-element synth, oscillator 2 syncs with oscillator 1. At other synthesizers, this could be different. So oscillator 1 could sync to oscillator 2. But for understanding what sync does, this makes no difference. The sync has nothing to do with MIDI sync or MIDI clock. It's about synchronizing oscillators. Let me try to explain it. It means at the 4-element synth that oscillator 2 grabs oscillator 1 and therefore does not have a life of its own anymore. Internal, it gets connected to oscillator 1. That's why I use the hand as symbol for explaining sync. If you have a synth and you press sync at one of the oscillators, you might be surprised. Maybe you do not hear any results, or only notice that the sound gets a bit tighter. So if you use 2 oscillators and set one of them into sync, it sounds more like a 1 oscillator sound. Here we have the Virus Beat synthesizer with the sound Brass 1. We can find the oscillator sync function inside oscillator 2. When I press now sync here, you can hear that the sound changes into a more tight sound. Let's toggle between on and off so that you can hear again the difference. Let's do the same with the Jupiter 8 here. Here we have the knob sync and it is placed inside oscillator 2. This means that oscillator 2 syncs to oscillator 1 if I switch this button. I made now a 2 oscillator type of sound and detune a bit the second oscillator. You can hear that the sound gets fuller because of the detuning by oscillator 2. If I switch on this Jupiter 8 sync button, you can hear that this full sound disappears and that it sounds more like a 1 oscillator sound. The full sound of using 2 oscillators disappears. Not very exciting this way, you might think. What is the use of sync then? But here comes the fun part. What happens is that oscillator 2 syncs to oscillator 1 and the effect is that there is no independent pitch anymore. It cannot detune anymore and instead of that, it changes in sound. So if I change the pitch of the oscillator that is synced, then the sound changes. Hey, that is exciting again. Let us go back to the Jupiter 8 and oscillator 2, which is now in sync. First, I set the oscillator mixer to only oscillator 2 so that we hear only oscillator 2. I can change the pitch of oscillator 2 and do this in chord steps, which are semitones. Listen to how the sound changes. As said, this has to do with the fact that oscillator 2 is synced to oscillator 1 and cannot change in pitch anymore, and therefore only in sound. If I do the same without sync, you can hear again the pitch change. If I switch the sync on again, you can hear the sound change. It gets more exciting if you take something out of element 4 and let the pitch change automatically. To give you a quick example for this and let you hear a classic sync sound, let's use the envelope 1 of the Jupiter 8 to change the pitch of the oscillator 2. With this knob, I open envelope 1, which controls the pitch of oscillator 2. And what you can hear is a typical sync lead sound. Again, oscillator 2 is in sync and its pitch is heavily changed by an envelope. If I switch the sync off, you clearly hear that it is indeed the pitch that is changed. But with sync on, the oscillator 2 cannot change in pitch anymore and has to change in sound. Exciting, isn't it? By coarsely changing the pitch of a synced oscillator, it becomes alive. We explained sync, but it's also called hard sync, because there's also soft sync. The most common is hard sync, but let's listen to soft sync. Here we have the Alesis Andromeda. In the oscillator 2 menu, you can select soft or hard sync. While playing a sound, I'm going to switch from soft to hard and back again. You can hear that soft is indeed soft and therefore is less useful. Regardless, if your synth has the option to switch between hard and soft sync, it's always good to play around with it. You never know what kind of nice sounds will pop up. Basically, it's important for you to know what sync does and that you can hear the results. Remember, if an oscillator is in sync, then it has no life of its own. If you change the pitch of it, the sound changes instead of the pitch. To get the best results, change the pitch in a coarse manner or use one of the element 4 parts to change the pitch. In the booklet chapter entitled Element 1 and Sync, you can learn about sync and get some more very specific background information.
How to make a classic sync lead sound. Here we use Predator. In this preset, we use two oscillators. And oscillator 2 is set to sync, and this means that it is synchronized to oscillator 1. If an oscillator is in sync, then it has no life of its own. If you change the pitch, the sound changes instead of the pitch. And in this preset, we use a free envelope to change the pitch of oscillator 2 in a very coarse way. This is the free envelope. In this free envelope, we can connect to the semitone of oscillator 2. This amount knob determines how deep the envelope influences the semitone pitch of oscillator 2. Just listen. The more I open this amount, the more the envelope influences the semitone pitch and changes the sound. This is what counts, but also your setting of the attack, decay, sustain, and release. I will turn these knobs now and listen to the change of the sound while playing. This is a very typical lead sound. It only can be achieved by using sync mode of an oscillator and by modulating it very deep using an envelope. Let's show it again, just by putting on and off the envelope. How to use sync for making new waves. As you hear, this is a very regular synth bass, and we can use the sync feature of an oscillator very well for making different types of waveforms, as we will do now with this bass sound. But first, let us set this oscillator 2 into sync. And sync inside Predator means that oscillator 2 synchronizes to oscillator 1. As you can hear, the sound gets very thin. And this is because of the fact that oscillator 2 synchronizes to oscillator 1 and doesn't have a life of its own anymore in terms of pitch. So the aliveness and movement sound of two oscillators is gone. Let's demonstrate it again by playing first without sync and the second time with sync. As you might have noticed, the second time we played it with sync is far from exciting. But if you change the semitone pitch of the oscillator, which is in sync, then it starts to get exciting. Listen. All kinds of new colors arise in oscillator 2. Let's isolate oscillator 2 a bit more, just by turning down the volume of oscillator 1. This way we can better hear how oscillator 2 sounds. And what happens if you change the semitone pitch of this oscillator while being in sync. Let's do this with a new groove. Okay, in this example, I keep on changing the semitone of oscillator 2. But if I leave it on in a certain position, it gets more waveform color. To give this sound more body, I open oscillator 1 again, and with oscillator 2's semitone pitch, I try to search for a nice waveform sound. Great, the value of this semitone is now positive 26, and it generates a very different, more digital tone to this bass sound. So in conclusion, oscillator sync can be used also for generating new types of waveforms. The only thing you have to do is change the semitone pitch of this oscillator and search for a nice new tone. LFO at sync oscillator. This sound you've heard before. It's the classic synth lead sound. And in this sound, we use the envelope to modulate the semitone pitch of oscillator 2, which is in sync. But also, other modulation parts we can use to modulate the semitone pitch of the oscillator. For instance, in LFO. Let's look at Predator to see how we do this. But first, we have to remove this free envelope, which is now controlling the semitone pitch of oscillator 2. And we simply do this by turning down the amount knob to 0. The next step we do is connecting this LFO. We pick free LFO 1, and here we pick the destination, which is semi 2, so semitone pitch of oscillator 2. By opening the amount knob now, it starts the modulation of the semitone pitch of oscillator 2. Notice this LFO modulation is very different than using an envelope, for instance. It is far more continuously changing the sound. Modulation wheel at sync oscillator. What we hear now is a kind of sequence sound played by Predator. But the sound changes during playing, and this is done by using the modulation wheel. This modulation wheel can be found on almost any keyboard. Most of the time, the modulation wheel is used to add vibrato or to change the filter frequency. But in this case, we use the modulation wheel to control the oscillator 2's semitone pitch. And this oscillator 2 is in sync. We connect the modulation wheel to oscillator 2 by using the modulation matrix. First, we pick the modulation source, which is modulation wheel. Then we pick the destination. This is the semitone pitch of oscillator 2. And then we open the amount, which determines how deep the modulation wheel changes the semitone pitch of oscillator 2. Let's play it again. Okay, you can also do this on your own synthesizer if it has a modulation matrix. But of course it needs 2 oscillators, and you must be able to set this oscillator into sync. But keep in mind that this modulation wheel can be active in other places. So check that out. And if the modulation wheel controls other parts as well, you might have to shut them down, of course. Arpeggiator or sequencer connected to a sync oscillator. What we hear now is Predator playing an arpeggiated sound. You might have noticed that each step of the arpeggiator has a different type of sound. This is generated by using oscillator sync inside oscillator 2. And you can modulate the semitone pitch of this oscillator by using the arpeggiator free row, which we can find here. Each step, as you can see, can have its own value. And with this, we can make this special groove just by changing the values. Let's do this while playing. We can connect the semitone pitch of oscillator 2 with the free row of the arpeggiator. Otherwise, it won't work, of course. We do this by using the modulation matrix of Predator. First, we pick the source, which is the arpeggiator free row. Then we pick the destination, which is semitone pitch of oscillator 2. Of course, we have to open the amount knob to make this all effective. Let's play it again. And now we open the amount knob very slowly to show you how the free row of the arpeggiator changes the sound. It is of course your own personal taste how much you'd like to have this amount. Please experiment with it. If your synthesizer also has an arpeggiator, but maybe not a free row, you also can try to use the velocity values of the arpeggiator to make about the same sound. Sync oscillator with various waveforms. Again, this is the classic sync lead sound, and we will use it now to show you what you can do if you change this oscillator which is in sync with the waveform. But first, let's isolate oscillator 2 a bit more by just turning down the volume of oscillator 1. What we can hear now inside oscillator 2 is the saw waveform. But because of the fact that oscillator 2 is in sync, it sounds very different from a regular saw waveform. But if we pick another waveform here, let's say a square waveform, then the sound changes again. Let's play it again. First, oscillator 2 with the saw waveform, and then oscillator 2 with the square waveform. This tells us that oscillator sync changes the sound, but that it also depends on what waveform you pick of that particular oscillator. What you can do at home with your own synthesizers is to look for presets which also use sync of an oscillator, and then simply change the waveform to discover how many variations you can make yourself. Maybe by just selecting another waveform, the sound will fit even better with your song. So give it a try.
As you know, in this training we use only 2 oscillators in the 4-element synth. And for purposes of explaining subtractive synthesis, this is sufficient. There are of course synthesizers on the market that have more than 2 oscillators. Let's give you an acoustic example. Here I have a bass guitar, and when I plug the string it produces a tone. Tell me, how many strings are active? Yes indeed, only 1. Another example is if I play a trumpet. How many mouthpieces does it have? Yes indeed, only 1. Let me tell you that the rules of the acoustic world also exist in the world of synthesizers. Which means, if I want to make a bass sound, basically 1 oscillator should be enough. Is this news shocking to you? Maybe you are thinking, the more oscillators I use, the fatter my bass is going to be. Here on device B, I created a bass sound called 101 bass. This bass patch is very solid and is great for dance music. And if I'm not wrong, it is used a lot. It's a fat bass. The preset name 101 bass reveals a lot about the sound, because it was inspired by the Roland SH-101 synthesizer. And as told, the SH-101 had only 1 oscillator. And indeed, if we take a close look at the Virus B patch, we can see that it uses only 1 oscillator. The mix of the oscillators is set to -64, which means you're only hearing oscillator 1. So, as you can hear, you don't need a lot of oscillators to build a solid bass. Take a look at what's happening in the acoustic world, and you'll notice that with an electric or an acoustic bass, only one string is going to vibrate when you play a note. Playing synthesizers gives us much freedom. We can use even more than one oscillator if we want to, even for a fat bass. But later on in this section, I'll show you that freedom is not always there. Acoustic rules apply for synthesizers too. Another one. If you want to simulate the sound of a trumpet, we can do it using only one oscillator. If I use two oscillators, I can never get the sound quite right and it doesn't sound like a trumpet. I can turn all the knobs until the year 20,060, but it still won't sound like a trumpet. Once I go back to using only one oscillator, then I can produce an authentic trumpet simulation. Oscillator start phase on today's synthesizers. In the old synthesizer days, there was no control in the oscillator section that let us keep the oscillator waveform from starting at a random point, or phase as we call it. Even on today's analog synthesizers such as the Andromeda, there's no such control or setting. However, with digital synths and especially many software synthesizers, this control is available. Although a random start phase of the waveform is the best option, it can be handy at times to be able to switch the random start phase on or off. In the beginning of this chapter, we explained that it's a good idea to look at the acoustic world for inspiration if you want to build certain sounds. If you take a look at a bass guitar and then we decide to build a bass sound with a synth, using only one oscillator is enough. It may be a shock to you, but you'll notice that on a real bass guitar, only one string moves at a given note. Fortunately for us, we play synthesizer, which gives us a lot more freedom. But this freedom ends when acoustic rules kick in and you start having problems with your song or mix. This can be especially true if you are trying to use two oscillators for a bass sound. Okay, but when does the problem start? I know what you are thinking, because maybe you already use more than one oscillator for a bass sound. Well, the problem starts if you use two oscillators and have them both set at the same octave setting. Like this one on the Mini Moog. I have both oscillators set on 16 feet. Actually, this sound is not so bad, but if you listen carefully, you can hear that the bass is not very stable in the lower frequency range. Sometimes it's loud and sometimes soft. Have you heard this before? Did you ever have a song in which the bass sound was never any good? One that had an inconsistent volume each time you played it and no solid body to it. There's an excellent chance that you have set both oscillators on the same octave. What is happening here is that because of this mixing of the frequencies, the fundamental becomes unstable. Something you do not want to have with a bass, of course. The fundamental is also a sinus waveform, and we have discussed this before. Remember, the mixing of the frequencies when using more than one oscillator always gives us three results: mix, double volume, or antiphase, no sound. And that is exactly what happened with this sound. The fundamental of oscillator 1 and 2 are at the same frequency. Because of the start phase of the waveform and the detuning, they start to mix. Then the fundamental suddenly sounds twice as loud or even disappears. To avoid this problem, the best thing to do is to change the octave of one of the oscillators. This ensures that the fundamental doesn't clash with the other fundamental anymore. Listen to this sound again. We'll make it into a solid bass. Another option is to detune both oscillators a lot. This is often done in drum and bass music. Because of the heavy detuning, the changes in the sound and phases are so fast that it is again a solid and stable sound. But of course, the usage of this type of sound is limited. Now we've discussed Element 1 and all its features. What you can do yourself in your studio is to search for the oscillators inside your synthesizers. Just take a random preset and change, for instance, the wave type of each oscillator. If you see more than one oscillator used, change the octave setting or detune one oscillator. If you notice that the square waveform is used or the pulse waveform, change the symmetry or the pulse width a bit. These simple changes already give you many different sound options. You might run into new exciting sounds, ready to be used in your songs.